Welcome back to the Daily Poem here on the Close Reads Podcast Network. I am David Kern, and today is April 14th, 2020, and today's poem is by W.S. Merwin, an American poet who you have heard from on this podcast before. And the poem that I'm going to be reading is called Finding a Teacher. But I was getting ready to record with my friends Heidi White and Tim McIntosh. We were getting ready to record Close Reads, and I figured I want to get Heidi and Tim in on this episode of the Daily Poem and help me explore this poem a little bit. So Heidi and Tim are actually here with me. Heidi, Tim, thanks for coming on the Daily Poem briefly here for a minute.
Thanks, David.
Thanks for having us, David.
You've heard from Heidi on the show. She's filled in for me a couple times. If you listen to the network, you have definitely heard from Tim. He hosts our show, The Play's a Thing, and is on our Patreon bonus episodes and on the regular show. And you're probably familiar with him already. So, Tim, is this your debut episode of the Daily Poem?
This is my debut.
All right, well,
I'm nervous.
Well, I'm going to read as usual. I'm going to read the poem. As I said, it's called Finding a Teacher. I'll read it once, and then we'll talk about it together for 5 minutes or so, and then we will read it again, and then that'll be it for today's episode. But here is W.S. Merwin's Finding a Teacher. In the woods, I came on an old friend fishing, and I asked him a question, and he said, "Wait." Fish were rising in the deep stream, but his line was not stirring. But I waited. It was a question about the sun, about my 2 eyes, my ears, my mouth, my heart, the earth with its 4 seasons, my feet where I was standing, where I was going. It slipped through my hands as though it were water into the river. It flowed under the trees. It sank under hulls far away and was gone without me. Then where I stood, night fell. I no longer knew what to ask. I could tell that his line had no hook. I understood that I was to stay and eat with him. So that's W.S. Merwin's Finding a Teacher.
That's lovely.
Yeah, Merwin is interesting, of course, because it would probably be helpful for the two of you to be able to see the poem, to see where the line breaks are and stuff. So if you want to Google it, you can. But also, there's something, the combination of the way his poems work sort of sonically, if you will, the way the sounds work is really interesting because, his lines all blend together. There is not one punctuation mark in this poem, but there are moments when you're supposed to stop. You just kind of intuitively feel like you're supposed to stop. But when I was reading it, I'm curious, when I was reading it, did it leave you sensing that I was stopping at the right spots or maybe stopping at the wrong spots? Or did you feel like you wanted more on a specific idea or a specific moment? How was the experience of hearing this poem? Because usually that's not something I get to talk about with people. People might tell me later, oh, I listened to the podcast, it was great, or I hated that poem or whatever. But, I don't usually get to talk to people in the moment and get their thoughts on what the poem sounded like. So I would love to hear that from you all. Tim, what was the experience like for you at just hearing it?
It sounded to me, for whatever it's worth, like you broke in all the right places. But now I'm going to contradict myself a little bit. When I kind of pictured the poem as you were, like right when you finished reading it, I pictured the poem and I was like, oh, it's a really neat column with sort of short lines. I didn't imagine what the punctuation was like, but I thought it was a very neat column. And then you tell us, no, it's actually not, it sounds like it's not like indented hard left. It's a little bit scattered on the page and it has no punctuation. Is that right, David?
Yeah, so it's divided into 5 stanzas, and the first stanza is 3 lines, and those lines go, "In the woods I came on an old friend fishing." So that's the first line. And then the second line is, "And I asked him a question." And then the third line is, "And he said, wait." So that's the first stanza. Then the second stanza has 4 lines of varying lengths, and then the next one has 5 lines, and then the next one has 7 lines, and then the final one goes back and echoes the first line, the first stanza, and has 3 lines. And those get progressively longer as you go instead of progressively shorter. So it's certainly not quite as precisely visually structured as what you're saying there.
Yeah. I said the word scattered, like it's scattered across the page. I don't mean to imply that Mr. Merwin is just kind of like, hey, let's put a line here. Let's just toss it out there and see where it lands.
Yeah,
I have a feeling it's not happened. Yeah.
Heidi, what about you?
I love hearing Merwin read because I get so much of a better feel of the flow of the ideas of the poem. I find with Merwin that, and now I'm looking at it, I did Google it. Now I'm looking at the poem and having the experience I often do with Merwin, which is his stands, even though he writes in free verse, everything is so intentionally placed that that's where my eyes tend to be drawn. For example, in the second stanza, there's 2 lines that begin with the same word, but. Yeah. In the third stanza, there's 3 lines that begin with the same word, my. In the next one, there's 3 lines that begin with it. And so I'm so drawn to those details when I see it that I love to hear it read. Because then I'm listening kind of to the whole narrative of the poem rather than just looking at those little details.
Yeah. But those details also add to the sort of, they're like the structural markers of the poem too. Like,
right, you need both,
and they're giving you a sense of momentum. Like you mentioned, the third stanza where the second, third, and fourth lines of that stanza begin with the words my, and that's the stanza that goes about my 2 eyes, my ears, my mouth, my heart, the earth with its 4 seasons, my feet where I was standing, where I was going, like that. And aphora, that sense of like repetition, gives you a sort of momentum as a reader. Like I think it signals the approach you're supposed to take when you're reading it. Kind of like, Tim's a playwright, and so there's certain moments I feel like when you read a play or you see someone reciting lines from a play, that it's clear that the playwright has given clues through the structure of the language that there's a certain sort of momentum you're supposed to take, whether you're supposed to speed up or slow down. And poetry has a sort of stage direction about it in that way, even, and it doesn't mean that a short line, for example, is telling you go slower. It could in some ways be saying go faster or whatever.
Right. Well, and this poem has, there's references to fishing, and of course that implies water, and it flows like water. There's just this fluid nature to this poem. That, are we talking about the fish? Are we talking about the friend? Are we talking about the earth? Are we talking about his body? Like there's just this fluid nature. And then those markers, as you say, provide a structure to it. And man, I'm so intrigued by this title.
Yeah, let's talk about that for a second, because that was going to be my last question before we go here for the day. Tim, what do you think of that title? Finding a Teacher is the name of the poem, but never in the poem is the word teacher actually.
Right.
So, what's your take?
It made me think. Our lead character. I still read poems like plays. It's such a bad habit. But our lead character sees his friend fishing in the woods, and he has a question about the sun. So it kind of positions the man who's fishing as the prospective teacher.
Yeah.
And for me, the key, like one of the lines that really jumped off the page for me was, did it say that his line had no hook?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. The final stanza goes like this. I no longer knew what to ask. I could tell that his line had no hook. I understood that I was to stay and eat with him.
Gosh. I don't know. I'm just going to sit with that one for a while.
Yeah, sometimes
it's a lovely poem, because this, to me, evokes Christ, the man fishing
That's what I thought.
On the edge of and the invitation to gather around the table. And when I think that that's what is so lovely about poetry, is that we bring to it our own set of assumptions, our own illusions, our own illusions with an A, maybe with an I as well. But we bring ourselves to the poem. And so in a poem like this, in which there's this great depth under the surface, this subtext, then we bring ourselves and our own stories to this, and we hear things from it.
it's toward that end, it makes me think, so the character that we're with kind of shows up with, it sounds like, cosmological questions.
Yeah.
Like the question about the sun, and what are the other things? Then it kind of shifts a little bit. What are the other things? I'm not looking at the poem,
Earth
David.
with its 4 seasons.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was a question.
Stream.
Yeah, it was a question about the sun, about my 2 eyes, my ears, my mouth, my heart, the earth with its 4 seasons, my feet where I was standing, where I was going. And then it says it slipped through my hands. The next stanza begins to talk about how the question at least seems to slip through my hands. But then I was wondering, do you think that, is it the question that's slipping through his hands, or is it the sun that's slipping through his hands? As if the days pass.
Or the what, David, that's slipping through his hands?
Perhaps. And I was imagining him kind of, okay, I mean, I think it could be both, but I think that, like, you know how sometimes you'll sit somewhere, and especially if he's been told to wait and he's not supposed to, and they're not talking, and you're just thinking, and, you know, maybe he's sticking his hands and he's sticking his hands out in front of him, and he's maybe watching the sun go through his fingers, like playing on the water or something. And then, like, as he's thinking about the question fades away, and the water or the sun even begins to slip through his hands. Because the it pronoun, it's not totally clear what that is referencing.
Mm-hmm.
So I love the idea of, like, the question fading away just as the day kind of slips through his fingers, you know? Like,
yeah.
Especially when you think of the day as a thing that you can sort of seize, right? You seize the day, but then if you're seizing it, then it can slip through your finger, you know, using that same metaphor, the idea of grabbing something. You know, you feel like you're going to accomplish something, but then the day fades away and it slipped through your fingers, and just whatever you were trying to accomplish has slipped through your fingers. And in the end, you know, all you've been taught is sometimes you have to wait, and then at the end of the day, you eat.
Right. And then it becomes unclear in a really lovely way who then the teacher is, because I think Tim's right that at first the implication is the man who's fishing, but then it could also be the question that is the teacher. It could also be the sun that is the teacher. It could also be the stumbling upon an unexpected experience in the day that is the teacher. Like there's all of these wonderful ambiguities that, again, we bring ourselves to, as well as the poem.
Yeah. I think at the end, the implication, though, is that because at the beginning he has a question, right? And then at the end he understands. And there is a sort of resolution, maybe not to the question that he had, but like there is a sort of resolution to the poem, or at least there's one implied, even if it's within the soul of the person, right? Like he starts out with a question, and at the end he understands. And he might be understanding that the original question that he had was, you know, not as important, or that the answer that he was given was in the waiting, that the man knew that the answer was there, but only if you thought about it. But sometimes you have to live with questions to get them answered.
Eat with them as a friend, right?
Yeah.
Like, let's gather around the table.
Yeah. Well, that's we've gone long enough for today's episode, but thanks for your comments. Heidi, since you have it in front of you, do you want to read it for the second time for us, and then I'll close this out?
Sure. Finding a teacher. In the woods, I came on an old friend fishing, and I asked him a question, and he said, "Wait." Fish were rising in the deep stream, but his line was not stirring, but I waited. It was a question about the sun, about my 2 eyes, my ears, my mouth, my heart, the earth with its 4 seasons, my feet where I was standing, where I was going. It slipped through my hands as though it were water into the river. It flowed under the trees. It sank under holes far away and was gone without me. Then where I stood, night fell. I no longer knew what to ask. I could tell that his line had no hook. I understood that I was to stay and eat with him.
This has been the Daily Poem. Thanks so much for listening. Thanks so much to Heidi and Tim for joining me and chatting for a few minutes. Be back